They called it a new beginning, a fresh start in a quiet town, far from the hurried noises of the city. But to 7-year-old Alex, the house felt less like a home and more like an enormous, patiently waiting museum. It was beautiful, framed by tall, severe oak trees whose shadows fell over the porch like heavy, dark velvet. The moment his sneakers crossed the threshold, the silence inside swallowed the sound of the world outside. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a profound absence. The house seemed to hold its breath. Even the echoes of his parents' footsteps on the hardwood floors were too loud, echoing up the grand, dark staircase. Alex was led to his new room on the second floor. It was the largest room he had ever had, which only amplified his sense of isolation. His father dropped the last bulky box, the one containing Alex's favorite toys, in the center of the floor. The loud thud seemed to instantly dissipate, absorbed by the thick, old air. Night came fast, coating the large bedroom in shadows that felt less like passive darkness and more like vigilant forms. Tucked into his unfamiliar bed, Alex looked down at the gap between the mattress and the antique wooden bed frame. That small, dark space was suddenly the most interesting and terrifying part of the room. He closed his eyes, fighting the urge to check the corners of the room or, worse, peer over the edge. He focused on his breathing, trying to make it slow and steady like the clock downstairs. But the stillness was too perfect, too absolute. His efforts to achieve quiet failed because the quiet was already occupied. The sound arrived, not as an intrusion, but as a subtle counterpoint to his own frantic pulse. It was faint, shallow, and impossibly close. It wasn't the creaking of wood or the wind outside. It was a steady, rhythmic, moist sound, like air being drawn across something rough and damp. It was the sound of faint breathing from under the bed.
The first morning brought a crushing relief. Sunlight poured through the window, aggressive and total, incinerating the vigilant shadows of the night. Alex scrambled out of bed and immediately dropped to his knees, staring under the frame where the breathing had come from. There was nothing there, just dust bunnies, a stray sock, and the dark underside of the antique bed springs. Alex took a deep, shaky breath, convincing himself. It was the pipes, he decided, or the house settling. He had been too tired, too nervous in a strange room. It had to be a mistake of the darkness. But when night returned, the certainty evaporated instantly. The moment his mother tucked him in and the door clicked shut, the massive room inhaled. Alex lay facing the wall, his back a rigid, exposed target. He tried to think of school, of cartoons, of anything that wasn't the 7-inch gap beneath the mattress. The breathing did not return immediately. Instead, there was a different, more calculating sound. A soft, distinct tapping began, not on the floor, but against the bottom of the wooden bed frame itself, near his pillow. Tap, 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 tap. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like a signal being sent. Alex squeezed his eyes shut until colors burst behind his lids. "It's the pipes expanding," he pleaded silently. "It's just the old house settling in the cool air." But the sound was not random. It moved. A slow, minute scratching replaced the tapping, dragging across the dusty floor, tracing the perimeter of the bed. He realized the worst thing about the sound wasn't that it was there, but that it sounded curious. The entity wasn't trying to scare him. It was simply exploring its boundaries, learning the dimensions of his sanctuary. And then the movement stopped right at his feet. The scratching ceased, and the breathing returned, closer, shallower. and now accompanied by a sound like the single, faint, dry click of a fingernail against the wooden floor, marking its patience.
Alex felt a new level of panic, not the frantic urge to run, but a paralyzing hyper-awareness. He was a statue, every muscle screaming for movement, yet utterly frozen by the proximity of the breathing at his feet. He could no longer blame pipes or old wood. This was a presence, and it was observing him. He remembered his father once telling him that fear was just a thought, and if you held still enough, the thought would pass. Alex tried to summon that calm, focusing on the cold weight of the blankets and the distant, reassuring sound of his parents' television downstairs. He needed an anchor to reality. But then the breathing stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was a shock, far worse than any sound. It was the confirmation that the presence was not mindless. It was listening to him, responding to his own held breath. Alex dared a glance toward the window, searching for the moonlight. The moonlight was a thin beam, barely touching the wooden floor beside the bed, and within that black pool beneath the frame, where the breathing had just been, two things appeared. They were small, precise pinpricks of light, not bright, but dull, sickly yellow, like distant candlelight through thick fog. Glowing eyes under the bed. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared, fixedly, waiting. The air around them felt suddenly colder, carrying the unmistakable scent of old dust, dry earth, and something metallic like burnt copper. Alex couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. He was caught in the gaze of an impossible thing, and it had finally introduced itself.
When the first eye vanished, it was not a blink, it was a withdrawal. The small, sickly yellow pinprick simply extinguished, pulling its light back into the absolute blackness. The second eye remained, fixed, forcing Alex's complete, terrified attention. It was watching him process the disappearance. The chilling cold that had descended wasn't just a drop in temperature. It felt like a void opening. It centered on the sheet draped over the side of the mattress, near his left calf. It was the feeling of air being sucked out of the room, leaving behind only the scent of decay and metallic frost. Then, a shape. Not the massive outline of a creature, but a small, sharp silhouette against the faint moonlight on the floor. It was a single, elongated finger, or maybe a claw, slowly rising from the floor. It was pale, thin and stretched, ending in a point that seemed too long to be bone. The finger found the sheet. It didn't pierce the fabric. It simply rested there, applying the slightest pressure to the thin cotton. This was the intimate horror Alex could never forget, the cold that passed through the barrier. It was a freezing, profound touch that traveled through the sheet, through his pajamas, and settled like an ice pick deep in his bones. The cold was its language. It was claiming him, marking the boundary crossed. Alex wanted to yank his leg away, but his body was no longer listening to his mind. It was entirely governed by panic. He realized with a shattering finality that the monster under the bed was not waiting for him to fall asleep. It was waiting for him to see it. The finger retracted slowly, but the overwhelming cold lingered in the fabric. The single, sickly yellow eye blinked out of existence, plunging the space under the bed back into impenetrable blackness. For a fraction of a second, Alex thought it was over, but the relief was violently short-lived. The sound of the shallow breathing now seemed to travel upward, echoing, amplified as something massive shifted underneath the mattress. The shadow that rose over the edge of the mattress was not the shape of an animal or a man.
It was a fluid distortion, an impossible angle of darkness that seemed to soak up the faint moonlight. It flowed upward, clinging to the edge of the sheet like a patch of oil on water, until it towered over Alex's huddled form. The creature was finally visible, at least in outline. It was disproportionate, with long, unnaturally thin limbs that ended in those brittle, pale fingers. Its skin was the color of damp parchment, stretched tight over a skeletal structure that seemed to defy gravity. But the most terrifying thing was its head, large and smooth, tilted in an expression of intense, alien curiosity. Its eyes were not the faint yellow pinpricks Alex had seen beneath the bed. Up close, they were twin patches of absolute blackness, voids that seemed to deepen the shadows around them. And they were fixed not on his face, but on his chest, where his heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. It was taking inventory of his panic. A long, slender arm finally finished its climb and settled silently onto the mattress next to Alex's head. The creature had moved beyond the passive study of the dark. It was now fully on his surface, sharing his space. Its presence was a suffocating pressure, heavier than any physical weight, yet utterly silent. Alex could only stare into the void of its eyes, knowing that screaming would only break the terrible, delicate silence he was trapped in.
The sound was worse than any roar or shriek. It was dry and reedy, like sandpaper dragged over a brittle piece of paper, yet it carried the precise, unmistakable cadence of his own name. Alex felt the syllables land on his ear, an intimate, impossible knowledge coming from a creature that should not exist. The paralysis was absolute. It was as if his consciousness had been ripped from his body, leaving behind a frozen, screaming shell. He tried to force the air from his lungs, to make the smallest sound, but his throat was sealed shut by pure, instinctive terror. His own silence was now an unwilling collaborator in the horror. The creature did not move, seemingly content with its masterpiece of fear. Its dark, vacant eyes studied Alex not with aggression, but with the focused attention of a scientist observing a perfectly captured specimen. The metallic, burnt copper scent was overwhelming now, a physical manifestation of its cold, alien presence. In that terrifying moment of shared silence, Alex felt the creature's long, pale hand slowly lift from the mattress. It hovered inches above his chest, casting an impossibly deep shadow onto the blanket. This time, there was no contact, only the anticipation of violation, a fear far worse than the touch itself. He realized that the creature was not trying to hurt him, it was trying to know him. It was a predator feeding on the purest, most concentrated essence of his terror. The longer he remained frozen, the longer it stayed, suspended in the shared, suffocating darkness. Time ceased to exist. There was only the creature and his final, desperate inability to move. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it began to retreat. The tall, angular silhouette folded back into itself, pulling its impossible limbs over the edge of the mattress. The heavy, cold pressure lifted, and the dark space under the bed silently accepted the monster back into its fold. Alex lay there, finally able to gasp for air, realizing the visit was over, but the horror was not.
The years passed, folding into each other. Alex grew up, and the impossible creature under the bed faded into the recesses of his mind, becoming what all childhood horrors eventually become, a strange, vivid memory. The metallic smell, the terrifying quiet, the wet breathing, they became story elements, not immediate threats. But there were residual habits, small unconscious rituals born of that terror. Alex could never sleep unless his bed frame was flush with the floor, eliminating the cavernous dark beneath. He instinctively checked the shadows of every room he entered, and he was pathologically averse to absolute silence, always needing the soft static of a fan or the gentle drone of a running appliance. Now 30, Alex sat in his small, modern apartment, staring at the floor. The old house had sold decades ago, but the memory was triggered not by an external cue, but by a sudden, pervasive, profound cold that swept through his warm living room. It was the same bone-deep chill that had clung to the sheets that night. He tried to rationalize it, a draft, a failing air conditioner. But the scent followed, metallic and dry, like ozone and dust. It was the creature's calling card. His eyes tracked compulsively downward, past his feet, toward the coffee table, then to the only open space of dark floor in the room, the gap beneath his sturdy, modern media console. His heart, which he thought had healed, began to hammer against his ribs with the same frantic speed as that 7-year-old boy. The creature hadn't stayed in the old house. It had attached itself to him. It didn't need the antique bed or the perfect isolation. It only needed the fear. It had waited 30 years, always just out of sight, always beneath the things he was trying to forget. The sound was identical to 30 years ago. The faint, shallow, rhythmic breathing, now emanating from the narrow, impossible space beneath the media console. Alex felt the adult world crumble instantly, replaced by the terror of the child. This was not a haunting. It was a deep, parasitic attachment that had merely followed the host. Unlike the child who froze, the adult reacted with violent, panicked energy. Alex lunged forward, not to flee, but to slam his phone's flashlight onto the floor, aiming the powerful beam directly into the shadowed gap. He needed to prove that the rational mind could defeat the supernatural illusion. The light found nothing. No skeletal limbs, no dark silhouette, no glowing eyes, just wood, wires, and dust. Alex's breath hitched. Had he been wrong? Was it just a trauma memory finally manifesting? He almost cried with relief until he realized the breathing had only moved. It was now coming from behind him, under the sofa, in the narrow space he had been sitting on moments before. The realization struck him like a physical blow. The entity did not occupy space. It occupied shadow. It was the negative space, the absence of light and attention. And it was no longer satisfied with only breathing. A dry, scraping sound began, not loud, but insistent, tracing the upholstered bottom of the sofa, right beneath the cushions. He remembered the child's paralysis and with a desperate effort fought the urge to freeze. Alex forced himself to stand, moving away from the sofa as if escaping a magnetic field. He understood now. He could never eliminate the shadows, and he could never truly leave the house. The creature wasn't under the bed. The creature was under his life. And the rhythmic, expectant sound of a single slow tap echoed from the wooden floor behind him.
Standing immobile in his living room, Alex's eyes were drawn to his own shadow, cast long and distorted by the single beam of his phone light. His shape was normal, but near the feet, where his shadow met the sofa's shadow, was a sudden small extrusion, a third element that made the outline wrong, a sharp, narrow point that jutted out from his ankle. It was the finger, that same elongated, impossibly thin shape he had seen 30 years ago, extending not from under the furniture, but from within his own shadow. The creature hadn't attached itself to the house or the furniture. It had woven itself into the fabric of Alex's own existence, hiding in the dark that was intrinsically his. He closed his eyes, fighting the urge to look away. He realized that the silence, the cold, the tapping, all the sensory cues were simply the monster adjusting its position within his own personal darkness. It was a symbiotic fear. The creature didn't need to live under the bed. It lived under the man. When he opened his eyes, the finger was gone. His shadow was whole again, but the lesson was indelible. He could build the walls higher, use brighter lights, and rationalize all he wanted, but he could never truly escape the memory, and therefore could never escape the presence. The creature was merely waiting for the next moment of vulnerability, the next shadow to fall. Alex turned off his phone light, plunging the room into comfortable, everyday darkness. He sat back down on the sofa, feeling the cold air settle. He knew he would never sleep again without the constant drone of the fan, never stop checking the space under the bed. Because even in the most well-lit moments, he understood that a small, patient entity still resided in the darkness he cast, always ready to whisper his name.